Welcome back to Freedom Fridays. In this episode of Freedom Fridays, we're continuing our series on hurts and the healing that God brings. And we have not only with us today Lee and Melissa Lennox, as we've had through this whole series, but we also have Ben Marshall with us, who is the Executive Director for Freedom That Lasts. And thank you for joining us, Ben. And of course, thank you, Lee and Melissa, for being on again.
For sure. Thanks for inviting me.
So today we're going to talk about addictions. And Lee, you already know we've talked about this a number of times. I hate that word.
I do too.
Because it gives the connotation that I'm stuck and I don't have a choice in this and I don't have, I can't get out of it. But yeah, I like the life-dominating sins way better than the word addictions. Well, Ben, so when we talk about addictions, what do we need to know in just framing the discussion?
All right. Yeah. So, kind of trying to frame this idea of addiction and what we're talking about. What I'm with you both. By the way, I prefer life enslaving sin over the word addiction, but I don't mind using the word addiction because it gets everybody in the right ball field, right? And as opposed to, what are we talking about? I think if I use the word addiction, most people are like, okay, I kind of get what you're talking about there. But life enslaving sin, and I was just talking to somebody yesterday about this. It broadens that, like, the whole scope out, and it's not just drugs and alcohol or what the world would call substance abuse, right? But now it can be behavioral abuse as well. So we're talking about pornography and eating and gambling and social media scrolling and gaming and all those kinds of things. Yeah, that right there. If that's what you would, yeah. But as far as framing it out, I think it's, I would put people into this category who have said, I've tried to stop something and I find it extremely difficult to stop, or so far in my life, it's been impossible to stop. So the thoughts that go through my head, the feelings that are attached to that, what my heart is desiring, I have tried to stop and change all of that. And for some reason, I can't do it. So that's kind of how I would frame that, at least for this discussion. And then the methodology, well, actually, the 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 approach towards helping, as well as the methodology, those just go all over the place. As far as what people might run into. I've worked with guys who were spending $30,000 a month at a drug rehab place, a residential home, and man, they were living it up, right? Like daily massages and all those kinds of things. Um, as well as people. One of the things I was able to do when I was out in Seattle was to help start a residential home, and those guys were at the bottom. They had lost everything. About 95% of them: spouses, girlfriends, parents, kids, jobs, money. There was one guy who was in there, and he got an inheritance when he was in his early teens. But it was $245,000. He got access to that at 18, and within 9 months, that was all gone. And it was alcohol, it was drugs, it was, and all the stuff that comes with that. So all that to say, I keep rambling here, but all that to say, that's the context. I think when I hear the word addiction, I'm thinking all these different things. So
Sure. Yeah, thank you for framing that up. So let's start with the background. What leads people into these addictions? So, there's a lot of talk around the world about what leads you into it. Is it my mother's fault? Is it my father's fault? Is it the government's fault? Is it environment? Is it, a combination of things? What leads people into these addictive behaviors?
yeah, and whenever I try and answer that question, I like to think in two different categories. There's influential and there's causal. And I think as a biblical counselor, if I ignore either one of those, I'm doing a huge disservice to the person that I'm counseling. If I ignore all of the influences in their life, so that would be, how was I raised? What was my mom like? What was my dad like? Or in some instances, grandparents, because mom and dad didn't raise me, or anything in the suffering category that happened while they were growing up. So abuse and all those kinds of things, or what they were exposed to. Right. I don't know how many guys in particular I've talked to who they were inadvertently exposed to pornography, but that seemed to be kind of the match that lit the fuse that then
Mm,
exploded. Or if I'm thinking more the drugs, I have run into and counseled more people who their drug addiction started with an auto injury or an athletic injury where they were given a
mm,
painkiller
Oh, yeah.
and then they got connected there, or addicted for purposes of what we're talking about. And then when a doctor said no more, they found other people were willing to supply them with either the prescription pills or something that is purely illegal but cheaper and easier to get. So, you know, I think discounting influences just leaves people wondering, what do I do with all this stuff in my history that I know is connected to why I'm using? But Ben, you're telling me I can't blame all of that on my reason for using, because the other category I like to think about is causal. What is actually causing me to do what I'm doing, and that would be the heart. I mean that we.
mm,
I'm not discounting Satan because I do think we have an enemy who's seeking whom he may destroy. I think that's he's out there. I also think the world would love to trip Christians up in particular and keep non-Christians from hearing the gospel. So I think all of that's true, but the number one enemy is going to be my own heart, because at the end of the day, addiction is a worship disorder, not a biological or
mm,
um, even not just a biological, although I think that's probably the heavy emphasis now is on biology. But yeah, so if you put the blame for the cause anywhere outside of the heart, I don't think you're going to be effective in helping someone change, especially into Christ likeness. I think there are routes to go where people find sobriety, but that's not the only thing people are shooting for. And here's what I mean by that, or should be shooting for. I've had numerous, I think in my counseling experience, it's always been females. So either a mom, a wife, a daughter who has come to me and said, Ben, I'm glad you're working with my dad or my husband or my son. I do think he is sober and he hasn't been using or viewing or whatever, but I actually preferred him more when he was using or viewing or whatever,
mm,
because he was nicer. Like he was just a nicer person. Yeah, sure, we ran into a few things like the bank account was empty, or had to go bail him out of jail or whatever. But this daily anger thing is actually worse than
mm.
all of that other stuff. So if we don't help people at the heart level, I think you end up with somebody who's sober but is angry, or sober but is depressed, or
Yep.
whatever. So that was a lot of words to talk about. When I think of how do we help, or what do we talk about, I talk about influences and I talk about causes. So outside of the person, influences; inside the person, the heart. And I think that holistic approach seems to be the biblical approach. It also seems to be have the longest, um, more effective, most effective route, if
Sure.
say it that way. Yeah.
Yep.
Anything to add, Lee, Melissa?
I was just I see the heart diagram in my brain as like
Yeah.
I'm a chart guy and Trevor knows that, well Ben does too, and it's like, yep, I can see these things, and I think a lot of times too, and going on with that, there's the people that are kind of like sucked into it,
Mm.
and the people that choose to jump into it, like thinking in the whirlpool and the biblical counseling side of things. I grew up in a house where my dad smoked regularly. I chose to do that, but I was used to it. It wasn't like I was kind of raised in that world, so I kind of got pulled through that, and I chose to do it too. So there was a choice. I was pulled in, but decided to stay. Um, and then there are those that they say, you know what, that looks like, those we've we don't see them as much anymore, but the old beer commercials where, oh, everybody's on the beach and they're partying and they're having a blast, and I want to have a blast too, so I'm going to jump into that world there. And so those things contribute as well, but ultimately it's going to come down to I chose,
Yeah.
I have this desire for this result that God has, to back up a little bit, God has given us good desires for Him and worship Him. And our flesh will do anything it can to get us to fill that need with something unbiblical or ungodly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I've seen it,
Um,
talked with people that they lived such a good life. Like they didn't have these, you hear about these abuse victims who, they were forced to take the drugs or whatever. But
Yep.
there was some and they're just like they were offered it and their friends would talk about it. And so it's like as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. And so if that's what you're meditating on, that's what you're thinking about, is going to flash out one way or another, whether we like it or we don't. And so it's those seeds of you'll be satisfied. And
Yep.
so I've
Yeah.
seen that happen.
and as we think about the two categories, Ben, that you split out, the more of the effective thing or the influential things, I think you said, and the causative things. The influential things are contributing factors, but then why I actually do it, like you said, is more of a heart thing. And now you made a comment about it ultimately being a worship issue. So let's unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I happen to think the number one thing every human does, whether they're aware of it or not, whether they want to or not, is worship. We worship something, and I can't remember who said that. Where it's not if we're going to worship, it's what are we going to worship, and either Lee or Melissa or Trevor, if you know who said that, feel free to give them credit. But as I look through all the pages of Scripture, that is the one key theme that pops up over and over and over is worship, worship, worship. So this idea of worship now, and this is where I think from when I counsel addicts, what they're worshiping can literally be millions of different things. This is where I will give credit to somebody, and I have yet to read it as it's always quoted, but he's always given credit, so I'm gonna give him credit. John Calvin said, "The heart is an idol factory." Now, I have not found those words verbatim in his Christian Institutes, but the idea is there. Is that the heart is an idol factory, and so what I love about that concept, as I'm talking to somebody who's struggling with addiction, you can have somebody who drinks alcohol, but they're drinking it to feel pleasure, right? And so there's one kind of heart idol is I want to feel good, kind of Lee going along with your commercial from the 80s, right? Like I want to join in that crowd. And so I'm gonna partake whatever they're partaking of. But you can also have somebody who drinks because it allows them to escape what's going on around them. And so whether it's school or whether it's family life or work life or all of those or whatever, even though they know I'm going to wake up probably in a worse state than what I was in before I started drinking. It's what I think Moses calls the temporary or passing pleasures of sin. And there is somewhat of a pleasurable time there. If whether it's the substance stuff or whether it's the behavioral stuff, there's a moment where I forget about the stuff that's going on that's hard, and I'm really just living in the moment, and it's a feelings based thing, but that's there, right? And we can just keep marching down the line like somebody who's depressed. They could take an upper, for lack of a better phrase, some kind of an amphetamine, and know that for a brief moment I'm going to forget the fact that I really don't want to live, or if they want to double down on not wanting to live, they know they can take, some kind of an opiate or something like that and just kind of numb out. So I could march through literally millions. No, I shouldn't say millions. Well, from an idle perspective, we could spend hours and hours and hours talking about that. Maybe we'd hit millions. I don't know. But definitely hundreds of counselees I've talked with, and helped counsel where the reason for their addiction was as night and day different from the next person I talked to. And I think that's why the whole worship thing is so important. When people when that clicks in their head, like, okay, I'm worshiping something other than God, who I was created to worship. Now the likelihood of swapping behaviors decreases. Meaning, I'm not going to go from alcohol to crack to gambling to this and that, because it all is still a form of worship that is not what I was created. Or am I saying that right? Not, I wasn't created to worship those things. I need to make sure I'm heading in the direction of worshiping God. So I think that's how I would start that initial conversation of worship. There is a diagram, Lee. You mentioned diagrams. I call it the white chart diagram.
Oh,
But
we're
That's
very
like,
his
familiar with
favorite.
Y chart.
okay,
It's my favorite.
yeah. On that note, my favorite story with the white chart diagram, I was doing some training, and there was a second grade teacher, and she happened to be in there when I did that, and she introduced that to her entire second grade class, and she put on note cards just a Y chart with two little arrows. She put it
Yep.
on the water fountain, on the pencil jar. She put it everywhere. And she noticed when she had parent teacher conferences, all the parents were talking about the number one thing they have gained as they watch their kids is this whole Y chart.
Yep.
We are going to worship. It's are we going to go the way of self or the way of God? And that was really having an impact on their life at home. So,
Praise the Lord.
but with addicts, I think that can be a very helpful visual of, especially if they're trying to stop. Like, every little decision becomes an opportunity for me to worship God or worship self. It doesn't necessarily mean it's sinful, but it will lead to sin.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
anyway, yeah.
So, Lee, give us your definition for meditation.
Oh yeah, so it's worrying towards a good thing. I think that's more Jim's side of things, but still, I'm borrowing that. But when we're meditating on something, it's the mulling over. It's a constantly, like they say, chewing the cud, if you will. You think about it. Chew it around for a little while, you swallow it, you think about it, and bring it back up and chew on it again. And I know that's kind of a grotesque picture to think about, but still, the point of that's what I'm choosing to think about is what I'm focusing on as I go throughout my day. And so when we would tie that back into our whatsoever's in the is he is that going through my day, I can choose to worship myself and think about the things I want to do and that my flesh wants and what would make me happy, at least in the moment. Or I can intentionally choose to think on whatsoever is good, lovely, right, just. And
Mm,
I know that's my version of that passage, but still, we can do
yeah.
that, think about what God has for us.
Good, good. Because often, in our culture, when we think about worship, we don't think about those things. We think about, bowing down and, somebody putting their head to the floor, like the Muslims that are facing Mecca or something like that. But we don't think about this is really what we focus our minds on.
Yep.
So then when you talk about it's really a worship thing, it's something that we're fixating our minds on. Is that accurate?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple things that have come to mind as you've been talking. If one acquaintance, one really good friend of mine. So I can't say Paul Tripp would know who Ben Marshall is, but he's kind of famous for saying we do what we do because we want what we want. And so there's that kind of idea of worship. And then my buddy Chris Moles adds in, and we want what we want because we think what we think. And so there's Lee's idea of this chewing on things. What it was a farming term. What did you?
Chewing the cud.
Chewing the cud. There,
It's
there
actually a
you go.
biblical thing.
Yes. Yeah, and he says kind of grotesque to think about. And yeah. But really that is at the heart of what what worship is. And then Ezekiel 14 comes to mind. And I know there can be a little bit of like, is that really about heart idol worship, or was that really about physical worship? But what I love, I'm just going to read it for a second. It's not very long. But then certain of the elders of Israel came to me and sat down before me, and the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, these men have taken their idols into their hearts, and set the stumbling block of their iniquity before their faces. Should I indeed let myself be consulted by them? And then if you skip down to verse 5, God says, I'm going to lay hold of the hearts of the house of Israel, who are all estranged from me through their idols. So there's this idea of heart idolatry, heart worship that the Israelites were regularly partaking in. And that was, and God, I think, out of love and care and mercy, said, Ezekiel, I want you to tell this to my people. When you come to me and ask me something, I'm just going to talk about one thing. I'm going to talk about your heart, and that's it. And the idols that are there, because I want to recapture what belongs to me. And I think that is a model for addiction.
Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you all next week on Freedom Fridays.